Director of Connecting Credentials, and we are really thrilled to be co-sponsoring this very interesting conference with Parchment. Parchment is one of now 113 co-sponsoring organizations of Connecting Credentials. And I know many of the organizations in this room are also co-sponsors, but I just wanted to use my time up at the podium to invite those organizations that are here, institutions, other organizations that haven't joined our coalition to let us know, and we'd be happy to include you in the conversations. Our goal is really to try to stimulate action at the national, state, local, institutional level to better connect credentials, to have them more understandable to people, to have employers use diverse credentials, and that people actually, all of the stakeholders actually trust all of these diverse credentials. My purpose here is to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Michael Roth, who is president of Wesleyan University. He's a well-known proponent of liberal education, and liberal education, we were just talking about that. I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you in this room are products of a liberal education? Yeah, well, I said 95. I think it's probably 98 or 99%. So this room also has, I think, all of the, or many of the advocates of credentialing reform, of changing both the form and the function of credentials. And Dr. Roth is going to perhaps challenge some of the assumptions that some of us have in starting on the credentialing side and trying to work backwards and try to influence the whole education process from credentialing down to instruction. And my guess is he may challenge some of these points. Just a little bit of background. There's a bio in the program, but his most recent book is Beyond the University, Why a Liberal Education Matters. And I think we all understand why liberal education matters, but that's clearly the perspective he's coming from. More interesting to me is his latest course, his latest MOOC course was called How to Change the World. Now, I'm not sure what that meant particularly, but many of us here are interested in changing the world of higher education, and so that's really important. So with that brief introduction, please help me welcome Dr. Michael Roth.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So if I close this computer, will that image go away? Is that the problem? Does anybody know? Okay, I'll just put this here then. Next to it. Okay, well, thank you for having me. I am the president of Wesleyan University, and I have to rush off back to campus just after the talk because my board of trustees is coming tomorrow, and I'm praying for thunderstorm. No, but I am really delighted to be in Washington, D.C. For a speaker. It's paradise. It's the land of the lowest expectations in America. I mean, all I have to do is not make a fool of myself, and I will get rave reviews. I hope this is being tweeted. So I think I'm here to talk to you about, and Jeff Salingo, who spoke to you this morning, was kind enough to connect me to Parchment and to the organizations represented here. Jeff and I have somewhat different views, mostly about, I think, tactics, not so much about mission. And we have, we put together on panels and from time to time, and so I'm grateful to him for giving me a chance to speak with you this afternoon. I want to talk about American traditions of liberal education, and you've asked a historian, so I'm going to start off. I have an old book with me. This is a book. Those of you who are in credentialing too long, this is a book. It's from the 1930s. And I want to read you a quotation from John Dewey, which means it's going to be long, yes. Conflict between The cultural or liberal and the practical will continue with result of confusion as long as both of them are narrowly conceived. I can hardly go into the philosophy of American life, but I do not see how anyone can doubt that as long as the humanistic is set off as something by itself, apart from the interests and activities in which the mass of men and women must perforce engage, it will grow thinner, more and more merely reminiscent of what Santayana called the genteel tradition. Dewey would have spit those words out. It is equally true that as long as the actual occupations of men and women, with the exception of a few professions labeled learned, are not affected by the larger outlook and the fuller background presented by the ideal for which the liberal in education stands, they will be narrow and hard, tending not merely to the utilitarian in its restricted sense, but toward the brutal and the inhuman. He goes on to quote President Morgan from Dickinson, insofar as the liberal arts college stands for a perpetuation of the traditional conflict between vocation and culture, the liberal arts college is doomed to play a constantly decreasing role in education. 1930. In a day when most of the occupations of men involve little more than manual skill and the repeated application of a few rule-of-thumb formulae, the concept of vocational as illiberal may have had some basis. But with modern, 1930, applications of all the sciences and arts to vocations, and the successful scientific search for principles within the operations and purposes of the vocations themselves, it is no longer true. It is rapidly becoming a fact that study within one's vocational preparation is an important means of freeing and liberalizing the mind. The inevitable result, he goes on to say, is the thinning of the wall that separates the vocational and the liberal. That was in late 1920s that he said that. And apparently still a subject of dispute and argumentation today. I am going to talk to you for the next 36 minutes about four main trends in liberal education in America, which in this book, which you can find very easily on Amazon.com, more easily than apparently Yale Press could have sent them up here for you. I argue that this tradition of American liberal education is distinct from liberal arts education in its European sense. I won't go into that very much today. The four moments are liberate, animate, cooperate, and instigate. I was very proud of myself that I found four words that rhymed, because I was giving a talk like this many years ago now in Beijing. And I thought I was giving a talk to about 15 people, and it turned out to be more like 700 people. And so it was excited, and I thought I'd come up with something energetic. And then I realized as I was giving the talk that my translator would make no attempt to rhyme the Chinese words. So I give them to you today. I use them any chance I get. And with liberate, I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. With animate, I'm going to talk about Emerson. With cooperate, Jane Addams. And if you're lucky, and we haven't used our 34 and a half minutes that are left, Dick Rorty when we get to instigate. All right. One more quote from Dewey. The kind of vocational education in which I am interested is not one which will adapt workers to the existing industrial regime. I am not sufficiently in love with the regime for that. And as educators, as well as credentialers, I hope that you do not have an abundance of affection for an industrial regime that is let's say, imperfect in its current form. I want to be clear, though, before I get to my 4 things, that I think we should get rid of transcripts. If I had more power at Wesleyan, and I urge you to write to the trustees immediately to give me more power, I would do away with transcripts and grades. Well, same difference, right? Alas. I'd do away with those things because everybody at Wesleyan gets an A or a B+. Don't tell everyone. Everybody gets great grades, and so they're pretty meaningless. So we've been talking about new modes of credentialing, although I normally wouldn't use that word. New modes of presenting what students are able to do on the basis of the things they've accomplished, which of course are not reflected in the transcript. Having a record of what you've taken has very little predictive value as to what you can accomplish in the future, but having a record of what you've accomplished in concert with others can really be quite predictive or indicative for employers, for schools, for other kinds of organizations about the kind of work you care about and can do well. My 4 moments, very quickly. Liberate. So I'm using Thomas Jefferson, and it's in my world, the world of university undergraduates, using Thomas Jefferson in a positive way is fraught, right? Thomas Jefferson argued when he founded the University of Virginia that the purpose of education was to create grounds for continuous inquiry, and that inquiry would be liberating because inquiry allowed you to declare your independence, to no longer depend on other people's opinions and so-called knowledge. Education was liberatory through inquiry when it was free and experimental. Jefferson's model was certainly the sciences, but he took his paradigm, his mode of thinking from the core European Enlightenment. As many of you learned and probably forgot, Immanuel Kant said enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. Freedom from self-imposed immaturity. And for Jefferson, that's the purpose of a liberal education. So that you can stand on your own feet, make your own decisions, take responsibility for the work you do, engage in inquiry, the pursuit of knowledge in such a way as you come to take responsibility for yourself. Now, this was a dangerous thing to say in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I won't go into the founding of the University of Virginia and all the disputes about it, but Jefferson had an enemy in mind, an organization that tells you what to say, what to think. For him, that was religion. For him, the religion was, or any institution that existed because of the perpetuation of dogma, had no business being at a university. Dogma was antithetical to inquiry, definitionally. And so for Jefferson, he realized that when you liberate people to inquire about anything at all, you were creating conditions for danger, for maybe anarchy. He said to his frenemy, John Addams, "Ours will be the follies of enthusiasm, but never of bigotry." I love that. The follies of enthusiasm. I tell you, I've been around undergraduates since since I was one, in 1975. And the follies of enthusiasm are why, I live across the street from a fraternity house. I know from, as my mother would say, I know from the follies of enthusiasm. But for Jefferson, they were much preferable to the dedication to bigotry. And Lord knows, we need to insist that bigotry cannot become a replacement for education in this country. Now here I am, 6 minutes into Jefferson, and I'm talking about bigotry and enthusiasm, and I haven't mentioned one of the most important things to say about Thomas Jefferson, which was he was a racist, that he was a bigot, that he took whole cloth the dogma of white supremacy. So I've said it, and it's important to say. But what was really striking to me in doing the research for Beyond the University, and I was very enthusiastic because I'm not an American historian, so things that most American historians know very well, I was discovering for the first time because I was ignorant. And what I was really excited to discover in doing this research on Jefferson and his world was that this notion of education becomes the core notion in the civil rights movement of the 1800s. And I ask you to take my word for it, I suppose, but I'll give you one example. Because this is an example from somebody who's been doing quite well lately, Frederick Douglass. I couldn't resist that. Douglass, you know, he tells a story that when he was a slave boy, his master's wife taught him to read. And, you know, you weren't allowed to teach black people to read in the South. It was against the law. Douglass would later say, brilliantly, I don't understand these laws in the South. They tell you can't teach black people to read. Why? Because they can't read. Well, there's no law about teaching pigs to read. Cows, there's no law about teaching cows. Why do you have a law you can't teach black people to read? And the answer Douglass found out from personal experience was that when his master's wife said to Mr. Old in Baltimore, not far from here, she said, look, Freddie, come over here and read from the iPad or whatever, the Bible. And he came over, started reading from the Bible, and the master, took a swing, yelled, damnation or something such. And he said, you can't teach that boy to read. You can't teach that boy to read. She said, yeah, I did. Actually, he's just reading from Genesis 6. And he said, no, reading will make him unfit for slavery. Reading will make him unfit for slavery. Those words stayed in Frederick Douglass's mind forever. Education makes you unfit for slavery. And I say to you, my friends, whatever credentialing, portfolio, it may be a badge, but I doubt it, but you know better than I, you come up with, it has to be able to show people who want to see an educated person that person is unfit for slavery. If you can't do that, if your credentials, our transcripts don't do it now, but if your credentials don't show that the person is unfit for slavery, you've wasted your lives. You may have gotten paid for it, but you've wasted a great opportunity. I'm a little melodramatic. I'm from Connecticut. I don't know what that means. David Walker's appeal, 1829. I pray that the Lord... But David Walker was a free black living in Massachusetts who sewed his appeal into the clothes of travelers. A price was put on his head, wanted dead or alive, because he preached insurrection. Slaves should overthrow their masters and kill them to liberate themselves. Here's what he wrote in 1829. I pray that the Lord may undeceive my ignorant brethren and permit them to throw away pretensions and seek after the substance of learning. I would crawl, that's my favorite part because I'm a professor, I would crawl on my hands and knees through mud and mire to the feet of a learned man, where I would sit and humbly supplicate him to instill into me that which neither devils nor tyrants could remove, only with my life. And here he goes on to say words that are still vibrant today, I believe. For colored people to acquire learning in this country makes tyrants quake and tremble on their sandy foundation. The bare name of educating the colored people scares our cruel oppressors almost to death. Walker's appeal was incendiary and inspiring. Higher education should contain the energy of that desire for liberation, because it's such an important American tradition. Unlike an education that was geared to the aristocracy of Europe, this is an education geared to throwing off oppression. And maybe why it's hard to domesticate into industrial credentials. Animate. I'm going to say a few words about it. I'll use my hero in the book, one of my heroes in the book, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson says, you know, what's wrong with universities today is that they drill their students. He would go to Harvard and talk to be the opposite of preaching to the choir. He'd go to Harvard and talk to the students and say, get the heck out of here. You know? Jefferson, too, he said, oh, Harvard, they don't have inquiry. You sign up to be a minister or to a lawyer or a commercial person when you started at Harvard in 1800. Now you sign up, you're going to be a consultant. But you don't actually learn to choose. You don't learn through inquiry. You sign up in advance. Emerson went to Harvard and said, you need to leave this place because all you're learning how to do is to seek after, he wouldn't have said credentials, but he would have said success on tests. And this, my friend, is what scares the heebie-jeebies out of people like me, people from the humanities, about credentialing, especially about badges, is that what's happening today in this conference and what happens all over the country is that you start getting content created so that people could get a badge, rather than creating a badge to reflect the content we think people ought to learn. And so when the bureaucrats of test making or certification create the experience of education, you lose the ability to animate the world, to use this romantic phrase of Emerson. What Emerson thought education should do is not so you could predict what somebody wants to hear and give it to them. What education ought to do is to make you find more life in the world, more vivacity. You would hear music where you never heard it before. You would see opportunity where no one else saw opportunity. You would pay attention to color and sound and oppression in ways you never would have before because you were blind to it. The worst thing that could happen in the educational reform movement, one of the worst things, there's so many things that could go wrong, but one of the worst things that could happen is that we get really good at putting blinders on people so that we can make sure they're not distracted and can get their badge. And we think that employers want that, and they may say they do. And if that is successful, we will become the call center of the world. I gave this talk in India 2 weeks ago. I had to change that part. No, because they know they're the call center of the world, and they don't want to be. They want to be innovative. They want to be creative. They don't want to just have somebody check a box. If we replace A's and B pluses, that's all we need, with competency badges that don't reflect the ability of a person to actually find meaning and life where others didn't see it, we will be privileging the anti-entrepreneurial spirit that has strangled the United States economy in the last 15 years. You know that's a problem when you have universities and colleges beginning to teach entrepreneurship. You know you're killing it off. And as soon as you have a badge in risk-taking, it won't have animation as its core. So I've given you liberate, and I've given you animate, and I've got not that much time left, some time left. Cooperate. So for cooperate, there's a bunch of people in the book I talk about under this rubric. Dewey is one of them, the key one. Problem with Dewey is he takes a long time to say anything. Oliver Wendell Holmes said about Dewey that if God could speak, God, of course, would speak the truth. If God could speak, God would speak in the language of John Dewey. It's Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he added, with a wink, if God was incoherent. Or inarticulate, maybe it was. Anyway, Jane Addams. Jane Addams was a real smarty pants in school. She grew up in Illinois, and her dad was a kind of Republican notable in the time of Lincoln, or the legacy of Lincoln's Republican Party. And she was one of those kids that you will see them in families, right? The parents are like, where'd she come from? She's so smart. She's incredibly talented. And she wants to go to college. She wants to go to Smith to become a doctor. And her father says, oh, Jane, you're a girl. I don't know. And she says, yeah, those were the days when Smith only had women. Okay. So Jane Addams wanted to go to Smith, and Smith said, and Smith was happy, but her daddy wasn't, so he said, no, go to this convent school for a while, see if you can do it. My daughter's in college now. She said she didn't want to go to Wesleyan because her parents, my wife and I, both worked there. They said, that's fine, you can go to New Haven, go to Yale. And she's in Pomona College in California. I should have said, you should go to a convent school first. And she would have said, you don't know from convent schools. Anyway, so she goes to the convent school. She does great. She's the editor of the paper. She's president of her class. She's doing great in her science classes. Knocking a ball out of the park. She comes home, Daddy, I want to go now. I'm going to become a doctor. And no, Jane, you're still a girl. And you're nervous. The 19th century, the nervous. Neurotic, they used to say. Now we'd say, I don't know, something else. So she's very distressed, but then her father dies. Now, I spent most of my career before turning to education writing about psychoanalysis and Freud. So I wasn't that surprised to discover that Jane Addams actually doesn't go to Smith. She obeys her father. In Freud studies, we say the most powerful father is a dead father. And in Jane's case, that was true. She says, I have to obey my father's wishes. She goes off to Europe with some friends to do the education of the kind of lady would do. You go to the opera. She even went to bullfights. She went all over the place learning things about culture. And then one day, she's in London, and she is about to cross the street, and she looks down to the side of it, and she sees a guy get run over by a horse-drawn taxi, horse-drawn cab. And she's shocked. And what does she do? She thinks of a verse of de Musset, who is citing some verses from Homer about the inability to react to an emergency. And she pauses then, and she says, I have lumbered my mind with literature. It's a great phrase, I think. I have lumbered my mind with literature, and I can't do anything with what I've learned. I can't even help this guy who gets hit by a horse-drawn car. I'm thinking about a poem about indifference. And she goes home, and she says, all of my quest for education has been about showing what I learned to other people who might be impressed by that conversation. I have not put my education to work. And so she goes in Chicago, as you know, founds Hull House, becomes this great champion of civic engagement, what we call today civic engagement, working with others, serving immigrant communities and the poor. She becomes the most liked woman in America until her pacifism gets in the way of the military euphoria, a familiar sentiment these days that it was familiar in 1914 and 15 here. And she thinks of education no longer as lumbering your mind with literature, saying, I've taken all these classes, or I can talk about all these poets, but she thinks of education as increasing your ability to work with other people to solve problems that those people and others find meaningful. We'd call it project-based learning, I guess. She's interested, as Dewey called it, really. She's interested in how education traditionally was isolating people. She wants education to expand their horizons into combinatory activity that also, and this is important for her, expands what she called the sympathetic imagination. She noticed in the first decade of the 1900s that people were going more and more into their own echo chambers, that people were tuning in only to the things they wanted to hear. So when there came to like a moment of strife, let's say a strike, the bosses couldn't understand what the heck the workers were thinking, and the workers had no idea what the bosses were thinking. They had ideas, but their ideas were only based in the parochial experiences that they had, because education deepened their parochialism, Jane Addams said. What it should do is to expand our sympathetic imagination so, as she said, we can see ourselves in the positions of other people. The height of pragmatism wasn't to just do things by yourself. This is what Jefferson thought. Jefferson was really an individualist. Stand on your own 2 feet, make your own decisions, be independent. Even Emerson, it was really about self-reliance, right? This famous essay, make the world alive in your own way, you as an individual. Jane Addams said, this is boy stuff. This is macho boy stuff. I'm going to do it all by myself. What we should have education teaching us, and Dewey was in her corner all the way, is to escape from what Dewey called the pathological quest of independence in America, and instead foster a culture of cooperation. How would we measure that? I don't ask that because I don't think we can measure it. I actually want to be able to measure the ways in which we are teaching students to cooperate more productively, more powerfully. At the same time as Jane Addams was writing, more or less, he lived a long time, W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about education as empowerment. Du Bois had the same conflict between the vocational and the liberal, if you will, right? In his famous debate with Booker T. Washington, Du Bois said, I don't want people just to learn how to fix the chair. I want them to have a broad liberal education. Maybe not everyone, Du Bois would have said, but don't decide in advance who can have that broad education. And what Addams and Dewey, and I think Du Bois ultimately thought, was that sure, we don't want like the English major fixing this chair. You don't want to sit in that chair, right? It's the English major. But you want someone who learns how to fix the chair, knows where the parts came from, knows something about how the chair will be traded, and in other words, knows how that individual skill is interconnected with other things. A great danger in isolating skills can be that we don't have room for seeing the interrelationship among those skills. It's not necessary. I mean, one could design for that, right? I mean, you could design for that. But it would be so important to not forget to do that. So that when you learn to fix cars, you also know something about not just the history of the automobile, but the place of the car in the economy, of the cost of the parts, where they're coming from, so that you can actually have some rights as to a fair wage and appropriate working conditions. So I've given you liberate, animate, cooperate. The opposites of them are pretty clear, right? In liberate, it's really to enslave. Without knowledge as liberation, you have dogma, and you have inculcate, indoctrinate as its opposite, which many schools do. That's what training programs are about. They're about indoctrinating, the opposite of a liberal education. In animate, the opposite would be to domesticate, to calm everybody down. Nobody will find anything too lively in our school. And of course, in cooperate, the opposite of that would be isolate. That people will learn to just go it alone and have no regard for those around them. All those are real dangers that we must guard against. And finally, instigate, the fourth, it was my anti-corporate side, in case you can't tell. I could have said innovate, but everybody's like, it's like saying, I don't know, just everybody likes to innovate. So I thought instigate would be good because of my teacher, one of my teachers at Princeton was a philosopher, Richard Rorty, and who was then at Charlottesville for years. One of the great American philosophers of the 20th century, I think. He would have demurred. I can hear him say, don't say that. And Rorty talked about the importance of education in the early years as being to assimilate the culture around you. What the best ideas in the sciences and the humanities and the arts and the social sciences. But then in college should really be about letting people reject what they've learned. Figuring out how to encourage students to reject the authority that they've been taught to obey. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from professors at Wesleyan and around the country who say, since the No Child Left Behind regime, college students have gotten really good at conforming to what they think the professor wants to hear. You think political correctness is a problem? Well, that's because it's been weaponized for particularly dogmatic purposes. The broader problem is that students have learned to do what they expect the professor to want them to do. So they'll be docile. They'll be you remember Leave It to Beaver? No, you won't remember. Most of you won't remember. Anyway, Eddie Haskell. Yes, Mrs. Cleaver. Oh, yes. Oh, you look so nice today. They come to my class like that, even at Wesleyan. But I can hear them murmuring as they walk away. Stupid president. So Rorty thought in college what should happen is the colleges should be a place where students could instigate rebellion against the authority around them, which is the space of innovation, of disruption, right? Disruption, buzzword has almost gone away. But a place for creating antagonism between the old and the possible. So my plea to you, because I think the work you're doing is really important, and I don't just say that because I have no one else to talk to today. I say that because I believe that the most important thing, I mean not the only thing, but the most important thing by far about a college education is what you do with it when you leave college. That's why my book is called Beyond the University, because I'm so tired of hearing colleges and universities talk about how, especially fancy ones like mine, talk about how great it is to be there. Of course it's great. It's like a spa, you know. I mean, you can't, you know, if you don't have a therapist in a week, you protest. If you don't have a massage in the library or a puppy at finals, right? I know how to make fun of students too. But what's really important is not that we give them all the stuff when they're there. What's really important is that when they leave with something they can use. And what you're doing is going to make clear to people how to bridge the experience to the use of it. I say to the freshmen every year what one of my predecessors, Victor Butterfield, said to students in the 60s. If these turn out to be the best 4 years of your lives, we failed you. Nobody cares what your grades are. Nobody should care. Nobody cares how much dope you smoked. Nobody cares how many times you pulled all-nighters. Let me see what you can do. My fantasy is I used to work at an art school. That's the beginning of a paragraph you want to hear the end of, I know. No, is that the student, like the artist, my artist at CCA would take out their portfolio and say, here's what I can do. And you'd say, oh, no, but I'm actually from a design firm. I'm not from a gallery. They said, oh, okay, I'll switch. Here's another, that's what else I can do. They were really good at showing what they did that they cared about could be related to what you wanted me to do or what I think you should want me to do. Because I'm going to show you, your company is great, Sean, but I can make it better. And here's the stuff I did for this other organization I worked with when I was in college. Here are the skills I had. Here are the ways I've learned to speak. Here are the ways I've learned to write. Here are the ways I've learned to use computers. Lots of examples. I don't think this is just for fancy places. This could be for any school at all that doesn't give up on the interrelationship of knowledge just because you have to show what people could do with what they've learned. There is no good reason to give up on the interrelationship of knowledge just so you can measure discrete skills. They're not, you don't have to do both. You don't have to give up on it. So I have real hope that we will have robust mechanisms of showing that when you leave the Santa Monica Community College, where my oldest kid went, that you leave with something that shows what you can do. When you leave Wesleyan, it's not that you say, well, I got into Wesleyan, so I must be good. Or I got a 3.8, like everybody. I'm bottom of the class, but but you say, no, here's what I can do. And that the employer or the organization or the robot that person is talking with has confidence, not just in the measures, but in the quality of the expression of the experience the student had that is relevant to what they'll do next. That's the value proposition that our colleges should be making. Not that you have a great dorm and you can play football, but that you can actually leave college with the ability to instigate change, that you can make things come alive, animate them through cooperation. And when you do that, you feel more free, and you are more free, because you've engaged in education as a practice of liberation. Thank you very much. So thank you. There's a microphone here, and there are a couple of microphones around. If anyone has questions, we have a little bit of time.
Thank you so much. So super entertaining.
Thank you.
You got my working class ire up a little bit, and I know that that's kind of where you come from. So my question is, you said a little bit it doesn't have to be a choice for a fancy school, but you very much come from a context of a $50,000 a year tuition with a 17% acceptance rate. And 70% of students that are starting high school are not graduating college. So a lot of us in the room are trying to solve that problem.
Yep.
And to what extent do you feel like your talk today is inconsistent with solving that problem, or can play a role in solving that problem? And that's a lot of the ed reform movement, is to try and address that issue, access, affordability. And so a lot of us are trying to deconstruct what that would look like to, you made a lot of jokes about the political situation, but I think the result of that is lack of completion and lack of access.
I'm sorry, the result of the...
Lack of completion, lack of access
has resulted in our president being elected?
Is the biggest driver of economic disparity in the country. And the economic disparity in the country
I got it.
results in this election.
Yeah. It's a really important question. I do think that, and this, Jeff and I have talked a little bit about this, or tweeted at each other about this too. Is my perspective elitist because it's historical? I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson and Jane Addams. And I say, no, you're elitist because you don't think working class people should have exposure to history, culture, and so that's not a productive way of posing the issue, it seems to me. It seems to me that the reason that people who pay no money at all, about 20% of the students who come to Wesleyan, succeed at 95% graduation rate is because, well, partly because they're really good when they get in, that's to be sure, but also because we support them, and it's not easy or cheap to support students. But we have found that we don't have to actually have different standards for people based on their socioeconomic conditions. So I think that, and I've given a talk like this to community college teachers and to community college boards. I understand the pressure. Somebody says, listen, I want this job, whatever that job is. I'm coming here to do a 6 courses, and you're going to make me do some writing and courses or some other courses to get my associate's degree. But what I'm advocating for is that not that we don't teach that skill, whatever it is, computer programming, auto mechanics, something in pharmaceuticals. I think we should do all those things. But I don't know that there's any evidence that you do them more cheaply if you do them exceptionally narrowly. What you do is you disempower the person upon graduation, so if they have to change jobs, they won't have skills to do so. And you make them a much less effective citizen, which I do think is also a symptom of the inequality in this country. We want poor people not to be effective advocates for themselves so that they believe billionaires will solve their problems. It's the greatest hoodwinking of the American people that I have ever seen in American history. I believe that if we increasingly think that poor people need a more and more narrow education where they don't have to think broadly about how what they're doing is connected to other things, that we will disempower them further. How exactly to teach those interconnected things? I'm not thinking about teaching Shakespeare or Greek or philosophy. I don't care. This is Dewey's view. It doesn't matter what subject you teach. We can, as long as it's interconnected. There's nothing more like real liberal education about an English major than a physics major or somebody who's learning to be a hairstylist. That's the European model. The American model is learn about it in such a way as you can continue to learn and understand how what you're doing is connected to other things. Because what you want to do with your education is be more powerful. And I think that's probably where we agree. We want our students to be more powerful when they leave. And I want to make sure that whatever credentialing we come up actually gives them a chance to have as much power as possible. And I don't define power by having taken a Shakespeare course. There was another, yes, whoever's got the mic. Yes, please. Hi, how are you?
Michael, how are you? Welcome back to Washington. Naomi Barron, American University. I would like you to please channel Jane Addams. Cooperate. By which I mean, in some ways, as I've gone through the day to day, it's increasingly clear to me that you're not really against much of what this group here is trying to accomplish. So let's put to one side for the moment getting a credential that shows you know SPSS as a research tool. That we understand has a real professional cast. But the tune that has been sung here, and for anyone who knows how to interview employers, what are you looking for? It's, I'll read the list, it's curiosity, creativity, communication, problem solving, team building, et cetera. And those are a lot of the core, call them skills, call them abilities, call them inquiry modes, that a lot of us would like to figure out how do you bottle to let somebody out there who might pay you a salary know that you have. And clearly that can come from the kind of education that's given in any community college, in any spiffy, expensive institution such as, I don't know, Wesleyan. How would you, as president of an organization, help us bridge that gap of taking those kinds of abilities to make manifest to potential employers?
Well, I think you've done such a good job already. I think that what you say is exactly right. That is that insofar as that's the list of attributes that employers are looking for and that we are trying to find ways of measuring, we're all on the same page. Yeah. And that's why I try to say a few times that I think the work you're doing is really important. I do not believe that the work we do at Wesleyan or other schools is in evaluating our students is helpful in this regard. We need to change. And so I think that, and that's why I started with those quotations from 1930, I think we should overcome this divide between the liberal and the vocational, as it was called in 1930, and we should do so by having better ways of making manifest the capacity of our students, be they 2-year students from a community college or 4-year students or 6-year students, make manifest what they can do on the basis of what they've accomplished so far. I do fear that the underfunding of public institutions, be they community colleges or state university systems, makes that much more difficult. And I think we'll have more pressure on accreditors or certifiers to say, we want you to certify a capacity that actually hasn't been cultivated because they don't have the resources to cultivate it anymore. So I think the more important issue, I suppose, in American higher education is that in order to cultivate and then measure the kinds of attributes you just described, you need resources. And we need to make the political arguments for greater public support of those kinds of institutions. But I don't think there need be a divide between those people who are developing mechanisms for expressing these capacities and those people who are teaching courses that don't actually think of what they're teaching in those terms. And I take it as an important thing in my university to do that translation for the professors. So we have just recently, talked about 4 capacities that we want all our Wesleyan students to show improvement in, and we're going to measure that over time. Now, that did not come organically from my colleagues in the faculty, let me put it that way. But I do, and it's probably, you guys could help us improve that. I mean, we're doing it without the expertise that many of the people in this room have about how to either measure or express those capacities and the changes in them. There's a question up front here.
So isomorphism is a very powerful force, and you joked that until the Board of Trustees allows you, you can't get rid of transcripts. But I'm curious, if you're this passionate about it, why not make your institution a model for moving away from transcripts or these kind of flat credentials and create a new mechanism for them to make evident what they've learned and what they can do? So
I'll tell you, just a confession of ignorance on my part, in case I haven't done enough of that. So what I've done and gotten up in front of the faculty, and I do this a little bit what I said before, is that I want one day there to be this something like a portfolio, and there's a Wesleyan alumna who's here who was at Wesleyan several years ago when we were developing an e-portfolio before, I think, avant la lettre, I mean, it was just, and we still have it. That's the problem with being early in technology. But when I talk to the people about that I want to replace the transcript, I've talked to the faculty, I've talked to the board, replace the transcript with something like a portfolio that expresses the changes in these capacities. The registrar and the Career Center have come to me and said, employers will never look at that. I did the thing with the art gallery and the design, because galleries look at it, and design firms look at portfolios, but they said to me, that's just not going to work in the Career Center. So I'm looking for what would work better. And I'm open to suggestions in this regard. I have to say that the short answer to why I don't make Wesleyan a model is because I don't have enough power. In all seriousness, the faculty decide many of these things. But I think if we were able to show the faculty, who are reasonable, I mean, they're smart as everything, and professional, if we were able to show them that not Roth's metaphor about a portfolio, but an actually sophisticated system that expresses the improvement or the lack of improvement in the capacities we care about, that we could institute that. So I'd be gung-ho to do that. We haven't found. We have isolated these 4 areas. We're measuring them now. We're doing a pilot with a statistically significant group of students so that we have something side by side with the transcript. So we are doing some of that. And clearly there's more to be done. One more question, I think.
my career, I've really explored this notion of self-assessment versus external validation of how smart I am, right? So what are your thoughts about, as you want to get rid of transcripts, about whether, and I'm talking about it within badging now, is like, can I just determine when I've achieved the badge, or do I need external validation from a viable organization that's respected to tell me that, yup, you can do this? What are you thinking about self-assessment versus external validation?
Well, I'm sure my thoughts are primitive because I haven't thought about it very much. I mean, I know there's research in this area, and there are people who've really thought deeply about this. I have the professor's cynicism about self-assessment. Especially at a fancy place where people believe many people believe they're very, very smart, and some of the smartest people don't believe they're smart. And so I realize in saying that, that's maybe not, that may be on the margins. It still may be good for a significant number of people, but I haven't seen, I have never, as a teacher, at the level of an individual class, I have never seen self-assessment work well. But as I say that, I realize it's just one data point, and you probably have a gazillion of these. So I'm sorry to sound so superficial about an important subject, but I teach these online classes. I'm teaching right now, actually, through Coursera, and we have peer assessment there. And so I've had, I don't know, more than 150,000 students in the last few years in a traditional humanities class, and then this course, How to Change the World, which is about different kinds of activism and development work around the world. And there, the peer assessment often runs into conflict with self-assessment. And I'm not hopeful that that problem will be solved easily in the format that we have for these massive open online courses. Well, I just got a sign from the back of the room that our time is up, but I want to thank you for listening so attentively. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Do we need this, or?
You can speak without it. That's
I think I can do it.
Do it.
I've been inspired. One of the oldest jokes in learning technologies, you go to ed tech conferences and hear someone for 45 minutes speak with PowerPoint slides about how bad it is for faculty to spend 45 minutes speaking with PowerPoint slides. So I'll try not to be a cliche. So that was wonderful. Thank you. As you can tell, we really wanted to close, not entirely on a contrarian note, because I do think you found the point of intersection, which is how do we help students make manifest what they can do so that their education is truly actionable in every sense of the term, both as citizens and as participants in the economy. So thank you so much again for a wonderful talk. So I'm going to keep the closing very short. We started with hashtags and handles, and we're going to end with a single URL. As you might be able to tell, and why we had microphones jumping around, every keynote, hopefully someone told you this, every keynote, every session and panel were recorded with the generous support of Lumina. So thank you to Lumina. That means that the parchmentsummit.com, which is its own site, which still has all of the content from last year's summit, so Art Levine's talk and Anthony Carnevale's talk and the great panels then, they're available under last year's tab. And then as soon as we can get to it, I don't think we have a commitment, maybe a month, yeah, probably about a month, we'll be able to get all of these proceedings up on the site as well. You'll get an email letting you know, and I hope you will share these resources, because that's why we did it, is to try to get these ideas out into the world. I think the only other final logistics I have is we have a trade-off, although it's not one that can easily be enforced. We will give you some light food and some less light beer and wine and some beverages immediately following in a reception if you will fill out a survey. But again, there's a disconnect in time. So we're going to give it to you in trust, but please join us for a reception with some food and drinks. But we are going to send out a survey. We really do value your feedback, and most of all, we value your attendance and participation. So thank you for helping to make this year's summit such a success.